It's great to see you here today, and we have a very special guest speaker. So Sharon has come to us from Oxford, and she has a PhD in fMRI, neuroimaging, and worked as a researcher in that field for 10 years. But she's now working mostly as a speaker, working with organisations such as the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, where she's an adjunct lecturer there. She also has several books and has spoken on the BBC and Good Morning and in the Times newspaper. So we're very lucky to have such a high-profile speaker with us today, and we're looking forward very much to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Martine, for that very kind introduction, and thanks for coming this lunchtime. I'm sure you're all extremely busy, and there are plenty of other things you could be doing on a Wednesday lunchtime, but thank you for coming to hear what somebody might say to respond to the question, am I just a brain? Am I just my brain? This is well, a question that I've been thinking about for a long time. And as I began to be thinking about it, I was reminded of something that happened to me as a child. Around the age of 10 or 11, I would say, I was sitting on a Sunday, kind of slightly bored, looking out of the window. And suddenly, from nowhere, a series of questions came into my head. Why can I think? Why do I exist? Why am I a living, breathing, conscious being that experiences life? I wasn't raised in a religious home. I'm a Christian now, but I became a Christian as an adult at university. You can ask me about that if you want to. So I wasn't really in an environment where I was asking lots of questions. It's like these questions came to me, seemingly from nowhere. And it's like I had an awareness of my own consciousness, my own existence. And our sort of sense of self, our sense of consciousness is really central to what it means to be a living, breathing human being. Now, to ask the question, am I just my brain, is to ask a question of human identity. Is that moving forwards? I'm advancing it, but nothing's happening. Thank you. It is to ask a question, the question of identity. What exactly are we as humans walking this earth? Are we just advanced apes that happen to have climbed our way to the top of the food chain? Are we just machines that one day will be superseded by artificial forms? Are we just souls that are kind of trapped in a physical frame that one day will float off to some higher existence? What exactly are we? Well, you'll be interested to know that this is not a new question. This is a question that has occupied scientists and philosophers for many centuries. It's also something that I got to kind of study and think about for a number of years. You've already heard that I spent over 10 years in the field of functional MRI, so I got to study the human brain, looking inside of it using this technique that enables you to do that without cutting into it, without invading it. I'm not sure if there's any fMRI going on here at Warwick. Perhaps there is. But anyway, I got to spend 10 years in this field, and it was a massive privilege, a huge privilege to do that. And there's no doubt, there's no question that the human brain is extraordinary. But just because the human brain is extraordinary, does that mean that everything that it is to be a human being can be entirely explained in terms of the neurons inside of your skull? Because the truth is that some very brilliant neuroscientists actually believe this. You might be familiar with Francis Crick, famous for co-discovering the DNA double helix that he won with James Watson in 1964. Well, a few years later, in 1994, Crick wrote his astonishing hypothesis about human beings, in which he said, you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the vast assembly of a bundle of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. Now, what do you think about this statement? Is it true that human beings are just neurons? Is this the best story that can be told about human identity? And the implications of this are significant. It's not just for the neuroscientist and the philosopher. There are actually implications for all of us. Perhaps the most prevalent, the most common one at the moment that is changing almost exponentially on a weekly basis, the area of AI. If human beings are machines, if they are their brains, then in theory, they are replaceable artificially. Human consciousness can be replaced artificially. And is that true? Is that actually the case? And the answer that you give to the question, am I just my brain, influences what you believe will one day be possible using AI. Will there one day be conscious androids walking the streets of Warwick? This is an important question for all of us. And of course, we know that many androids and algorithms are passing the Turing test now, the test developed by Alan Turing in the 1950s to determine the so-called intelligence of an algorithm, whether it can be distinguished from that of a human being. And of course, algorithms are passing this test again and again and again, and we see it only too obviously with things like large language models such as ChatGPT. The philosopher John Searle, though, developed a thought experiment to say, look, just because an algorithm passes the Turing test does not speak to whether it is conscious or not. And he developed this test called the Chinese room. And he said, look, imagine somebody outside a closed room passing Chinese messages to somebody inside a closed room. Now, the person inside the room does not speak Chinese. All they have is a code book through which they can decode the messages coming in, work out what it's saying, work out a response, and send it back out. Now, to the person outside, it seems like the person inside speaks Chinese. But this is not the case. All they have learned to do is process characters and output a response. And Searle uses this thought experiment to make the point that just because an algorithm or an android appears to be conscious in the way that humans are, that does not necessarily mean that it is conscious. And I think one of our biggest challenges will be in distinguishing something that it is actually conscious and something that has the appearance of being conscious but is in fact very different to a human being. So really the essence of what I want to say in this talk is the reason why, spoiler alert, you are more than just your brain is because you don't just have a brain, you also have a mind. There's also a you. Yes, you have a brain with all of its neurons and chemicals and transmitters and hormones and synapses and all of the physical stuff that's kind of whirring around inside your skull. But you also have a mind with all of your thoughts and feelings and memories and emotions and decisions. And the million-dollar question really that sits at the heart of this whole conversation is, what is the relationship between these two things. How do you get from neurons in your head, chemical and electrical activity inside your skull, to what it's like to be you? Is it even possible? How do you get from brain cells to, I've had a really difficult day today? Or electrical activity to, I think it's going to be a chai latte this afternoon. You know, the stuff that's just going on in your head. How do non-conscious neurons generate conscious you? And this is what's known as the mind-brain problem, or historically, the body-soul problem in the ancient world. Or as some people put it, Professor Susan Greenfield, and who is not a theist, didn't used to be, actually is possibly changing her views, but she put it like this: how does the water of boring old brain cells and sludgy stuff translate into the wine of phenomenological, subjective experience? How do you get from water to wine? Very interesting language that she uses. Or as Professor David Chalmers puts it, he has named it the hard problem of consciousness. Again, not a theist, but recognizes that this is an extremely hard problem to solve. How you explain conscious experience from non-conscious neurons. And of course, the perspective driving the view of people like Francis Crick is to say that the mind is the brain. These two things are essentially the same thing. Mental states are brain states. Mental processes are brain processes. These two things are synonymous, they are identical. But is that the case? And again, there are significant implications of this view, because if it's true that it's really all just neurons driving all of our thoughts, then how do we know that the things that we decide and think and say and do are coming from us? Or are they just coming from forces beyond our control inside of our skull? Because that is essentially what this view is saying. If mental states are ultimately just brain states, then how can we even say that the things you do and think and decide are your thoughts? Are they not simply the forces of nature inside of your skull doing their thing? And this question became very real to me one time when I was just given a talk like this at a school on the South Coast, and a pupil put his hand up and said to me how he didn't actually believe that free will was a thing precisely because everything was determined. And I said to this pupil, so what do you want me to do with your statement? Do you want me to act as if what you're saying is true, in which case your statement means nothing because it isn't actually yours? It's coming from forces beyond your control inside of your brain. Or do you want me to accept that it's coming from you, in which case what you're saying is false, because then there must be a you that is the bearer of your viewpoint and your opinion? You see, we get into all kinds of sticky situations according to this way of seeing the world, and we seem to live as though we are the bearer of our thoughts and actions. We award degrees, we take exams and are awarded a grade on the basis that we actually deserve that, rather than simply it being predetermined by things beyond our control. We reward good behavior, we punish bad behavior on the basis that humans can be held morally responsible for their actions because they actually did choose them. So there are implications of these views. So let me explain a little bit more why mind is very different to brain. Why? There are many atheists and agnostics, as well as Christian theists, that believe that mind and brain are two very different things. Perhaps you are a coffee drinker, maybe you're not. I know it's not a given. I am. Perhaps some of you have had one of these today. Imagine that we did just live in a materialist world and all we have at our disposal are the forces of nature acting on matter. So describe to me the smell of coffee. So you might offer me the chemical structure of the volatile compounds in coffee. And that would be really interesting and beautiful and elegant. Anyone doing chemistry here? Yeah, I used to love chemistry. I did biochemistry actually back in the day. But that was a long time ago. Anyway, that would be wonderful, but it wouldn't get you any closer to the smell of coffee. Or what about if I offer you a beautiful description of the physiology that takes place as you drink the coffee and digest it? That also would be wonderful, but it wouldn't get you any closer to the smell of coffee. What do you need to do to enter and understand the smell of coffee? You actually need to smell it. There's actually no other way that you can encounter this phenomenon. And this is an example of a quail in its singular, or plural, qualia. And qualia is a term that philosophers use to describe qualitative experiences that are impossible to describe physically. Another way of putting the same thing is, imagine we wanted to do an experiment to find out what it's like for you to sit your next set of exams. And we put an EEG cap on you that can measure all kinds of wonderful signals from deep within your brain that are transmitted to your scalp. And we can leave that on 24/7. We can capture what's going on when you're sleeping, when you're awake. And we could pop you in an MRI scanner. We could take some structural scans of your brain. We could take some functional scans. We could collect some really beautiful data from your brain. Will that tell us what it is like for you to go through your next set of exams? Will that tell us what it's like for you to cope with stress and expectations and career pressure and competition? Of course not. Yeah, we can measure all the things we like from your brain, but unless you reveal what's going on in your mind to us, we cannot access that. And for this reason, many agnostics and atheists, as well as Christian theists, acknowledge that mind and brain are two very different things. It is not a done deal to say one is the same as the other. These are very, very different things. Yes, they are connected, and the science shows they're connected. If you put someone in an MRI scanner and you give them an activity that uses their mind, you will see brain networks light up. Clearly, these two are connected. But just because they are connected does not necessarily mean they're identical or synonymous, or that one cancels out the other. This is actually a deeper thing. And so there are some other ways of looking at the mind-brain relationship that help make more sense of us as human beings, that offer a more holistic way of seeing the world. I'm actually not going to go into them in too much detail because I do want to leave plenty of time for questions. But I just want to give you a little whistle-stop tour of some of the other ways of thinking about this, just so that you know that there isn't just one view out there. Actually, people think lots of different things. So one view is that the brain generates the mind. This is still similar to the other view in the sense that it's saying that the brain is all that's necessary for the mind, but it's saying a bit more than that, that when a number of brain parts come together, something new pops into being that is greater than the sum of its original building blocks. A bit like when you watch a film, a film's got a number of different a number of different components. It's got a cast, it's got a director, it's got a soundtrack, it's got a camera crew, and so on. All of those building blocks are essential, but when you watch the film, you're not aware of any of those. You experience something that's greater than the sum of those building blocks. And that's a little bit like what this view is saying, that the mind is something that emerges from the physicality of the brain, but can't be reduced back to physics and chemistry. And that's someone that believes that. But of course, this doesn't change the nature of the hard problem. Just because you put the word emerge there or generate, that doesn't change the nature of the problem. How do non-conscious neurons generate conscious human beings? You still have a hard problem to solve. Unless, of course, the system isn't a closed one of cause and effect. Unless, of course, we don't just live in a materialist universe. If there's more information involved, then potentially there's hope for crossing the chasm from non-conscious neurons to conscious humans. Another view is to say that the mind is beyond the brain. This view actually says that the brain is a physical substance, but there's also another substance that's non-physical. The mind is a non-physical substance, and these two things interact very closely, but they are distinct substances. But of course, the challenge that people holding this view have to face is why would there be two distinct substances when the science shows them to be so integrated? Why do we have to think in terms of two substances? What does it even mean that the mind is a non-physical substance? What does it mean that there's something non-physical in this universe that seems so physical? And so that's the challenge. Every view has its challenges. You know, none is a kind of a knockdown, done deal, sorted view. And then a final and increasingly popular view is actually to flip the whole conversation on its head and say, look, we're actually not getting anywhere when we just start with the building blocks of the brain and try and build a bridge back to the conscious mind. Why don't we flip that on its head and assume that mind is fundamental to the universe, that actually everything is reducible to the mind rather than everything is reducible to physics and chemistry and neurons. And this view says everything is conscious. It's called panpsychism, which comes from the word pan, meaning all, and psyche, meaning soul. And it says actually there are elements of consciousness in every living thing, right from humans through the animal kingdom, plants, and down even to the atomic scale. And actually, David Chalmers is a proponent of this view, saying, you know, we need to take consciousness as fundamental to the universe. That's an interesting thought, isn't it? What if consciousness is fundamental to the universe? And Philip Goff, who would say that even electrons and quarks have unimaginably simple forms of experience, which is a mind-boggling concept. I mean, electrons and quarks on their own are fairly mind-boggling, but to then attribute elements of consciousness to them adds a whole nother level of stuff. I'm not going to talk about that, but we can come back to that later. But what I want to do for the last couple of minutes before we go into questions is to say, look, we've had a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the philosophical landscape around this question, hopefully to show you there are many different ways of thinking about this. And what I've shown you is philosophical views. None of those are scientifically provable, by the way. There is no scientific experiment that you can do that will enable you to prove that that is what's happening, or any of the other views that I've presented. All you can say from the science is that mind and brain are connected. They are correlated. Everything else has stepped out of the realm of science and into philosophy. And it's really important that we recognize that when we're no longer dealing in scientific empiricism and we're into philosophical debate. But then if we move into the field of clinical neuroscience, if we actually start to look at patients, we see some very interesting things. We see, for example, that there are a small number of adults walking this earth for whom 95% of their brain tissue no longer exists. They had hydrocephaly water on their brain as a child, and have survived and gone on to be normal, healthy, functioning adults with virtually no cortical tissue inside their skull. How do we make sense of this in light of the view that you are just your brain? I'm not saying that there aren't ways around it neuroscientifically, but I am saying that when you start to look at people, things are complex. You know, people are not straightforward. They give us food for thought. Secondly, there's an area known as near-death experiences that's been around since the 1960s, and it's a set of data that's saying that there are people that have technically clinically died on the operating table, been declared dead by a doctor, brain waves are no longer recorded, and then because now we can resuscitate patients, we have that ability. Some patients on resuscitation are saying, when you declared me physiologically dead, I was actually vividly conscious and able to recount details that could be verified. And this is a really fascinating data set. I'm not denying that there are some slightly odd things out there on YouTube, but actually we can't ignore 50 years of data from cardiologists and neurologists that have given their careers to systematically looking at this across countries, across patient populations. There are journals that were founded in order to record the data. There are handbooks and so on. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think we have to ask the question, how do we make sense of this? And especially when people change their views based on their own near-death experience. One such person is Eben Alexander, who's on the slide behind me, who was a former Harvard neurosurgeon, and Harvard neurosurgeons are strict materialists. If you don't have a functioning brain, you cannot be conscious. That's the prevailing view amongst Harvard neurosurgeons. And that was his view, until at the age of 54, he developed a severe bacterial meningitis. He went into a coma. He was there for 7 days. He was actually not expected to recover. All of the areas of the brain known to correlate with consciousness had entirely shut down. His family were told to put their affairs in order because he wasn't expected to recover. And yet, extraordinarily, he did. He went on to make a full recovery, and he recounted an extremely vivid conscious experience, including meeting a daughter that he never knew that he had. A sister. That he was actually adopted, and his sister had been adopted elsewhere before he was born, but he had a sister, and he met this sister in this experience. If we are just our brains, then how do you make sense of data like that? Of course, there are all kinds of critiques that could be raised against them, but there are also responses to those critiques that are out there from people that have thought quite long and hard about it. And of course, Eben Alexander has something very extraordinary to say, that he was so convinced that what happened to him was real. He said, "My experience showed me that the death of the body and the brain are not the end of consciousness, that human experience continues beyond the grave." Now, it's interesting that he was willing to even change his view. That says something about what he believed happened to him, regardless of what other people might say. Now, when we actually look at the human makeup, we actually see that there's a picture of complexity as well. So when you start to open the pages of the Bible, you don't actually see something that contradicts the science. You see something that actually agrees with it, because the Bible says that humans are complex in their makeup as well. They are both physical and spiritual. A lot of people describe themselves as being spiritual today. Actually, the Bible says that makes sense with how we see things as well, that we're both physical matter and we are spiritual as well. I'm not going to go into that too much, but I'm just going to move on to this question. You see, even if all of our other questions about the workings of the brain and its relationship to the mind are answered. There will still be some questions that remain unanswered. Questions that science cannot answer and that science was never intended to answer. Questions like, why can I think at all? Questions like the one I found myself asking as a 10-year-old child, slightly bored, not even searching for anything. Questions that came to me rather than me even looking for them. Why can we think in the first place? Why do we even have a conscious mind at all? What is the point? And where do the most persuasive answers lie to this question? Well, if there is no God, if we are in a materialist universe of the forces of nature and of time plus matter plus chance, then human consciousness is not impossible, but it's surprising. Because you start off with a non-conscious universe and somehow conscious humans have arisen. It's not impossible, but it is surprising. And there are lots of arguments out there trying to explain how conscious humans have arisen from within a non-conscious universe. However, if God exists, then it is the case that we did not start simply with matter, but with a conscious being known as God. In other words, we've lived in a conscious universe all along. Why can we think? We can think because God thinks. We are conscious because we are made by a conscious community of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That Christians believe that actually before there was anything physical, there was God. And God has actually given us the minds that we have as part of a reflection of the fact that we're made by him, which also means that using your mind is not an anti-religious thing to do. It's actually at the very center of what it means to be someone that's made by God, to use your mind, to study and work hard and think and all of these things. And so that is what I came to discover actually in my 20s, at the age of 20, as a scientist actually, studying biochemistry. And it was an extraordinary discovery to make. And I think I'm actually going to leave it there because I want to allow time for questions. You can ask me any question that you want. You can ask me about my own story. You can ask me about anything that I've said. But I want to leave you with the possibility. Is it possible that there's more to this world than we can simply see with our eyes? That there is a God who, although we can't necessarily see him, actually sees us and has given us the minds that we have. And those minds, their ultimate purpose, if you like, is actually to look beyond simply what's in front of us and to really ask big questions about life, about what's really true, and use our minds to arrive at a truth about the world as well. Thank you so much for listening.
So thank you, Sharon, for a great talk. And now we're going to invite some questions.
So, some would say, not necessarily everyone would agree, but yes. Okay, ask me your whole question, and then I will respond. Okay. Okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. So the question is, do I believe that we are spirit, soul, and body? What is the difference between the spirit and the soul? And where is the mind located? I'm going to possibly say the last one first. I would say that questions like the location of the mind, again, so much of how we think about this shows how we're influenced by materialism, which says that we have to think in terms of location, temporally and spatially, about everything. But I actually think that the mind and soul actually are phenomena that are sort of slightly, that they sort of slightly defy those terms. I don't think they have a location. I don't think they can be located physically, and so it just requires us to hold them a little bit differently to how we're thinking about the world. In terms of, I think there is a difference between the soul and the spirit, depending on the way you're thinking about them. So a way of thinking about the soul, it's a very slippery term. Different people believe different things. Perhaps one of the easiest ways to describe it is like the deepest essence of you, of what it is to be you. But I also want to say that a lot of people think about, when they think about soul, they think about this immaterial thing that floats off to heaven one day. But actually, a Hebrew view of the soul is actually very integrated, that it's integrated with the physical, that we are integrated physically and spiritually. But in terms of the person, spirit and soul, with a small s, are both ways of kind of describing the person. And certainly if you read the pages of the Bible, it will talk about spirit and soul with a small s as like the inner self, that's the inner you. They also use words like heart and mind. And these are all kind of different ways of saying there's a core reality to you that can't just be captured in terms of the physical. And so these are kind of really important terms to say there's a deep sense of what it means to be you that isn't just captured materially. Now, that's not the same as the Holy Spirit with a capital S. So I believe that everybody has a soul and a spirit with a small s, that there's a sense of what it is to be you. But only those that invite the Holy Spirit have the Holy Spirit. And that's actually what it means to be a Christian. It's available to everyone through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. To be a Christian is to have the life of God alive and at work in you. That is what the Holy Spirit does. That is a layer that sits on top of soul and spirit with a small s, and that I believe breathes life into everything about what it means to be human, makes us more alive, more ourselves, more able to engage, more able to make a difference. So there are lots of different layers to this question. The Holy Spirit is the Spirit of God, the Spirit of Jesus that kind of comes into who we are and makes us more alive as well. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. So any more questions? Yep.
Thank you. Fantastic talk. I was wondering, do you believe that consciousness, or we call cognitive functions, they have biological basis? Because the evidence are, some patients with schizophrenia, for example, they have like negative symptom and positive symptom, like hallucination, like they think something spiritual things is attacking them. So, but some scientists find that there are actually certain kind of neurons have some defects in the brain, and so they believe that even this kind of cognitive thing aspects also have biological basis. And I was wondering, how do you think this?
Thank you so much for the question. I think what I want to say is that I think what clearly that the neuroscience is saying is that mental states and brain states, or conscious states and brain states, are clearly connected. So most of the time we see connection. We see a sense of continuity between what's happening in the brain and what's happening consciously. And we see this in child development. We see it in brain injury and trauma going in the opposite direction. We see it in neurodegeneration and so on. But I also think we see moments of discontinuity that make us think, okay, this is not like a linear thing. This is not completely 100% the case. There are sometimes instances of discontinuity where the brain state does not equal the conscious state. And we need to kind of wrestle with that and make sense of that. And there are people in the medical field that are also doing that. And now when it comes to kind of spiritual experience and engagement, we see the same. You know, there was a slide that I glossed over there, that there are plenty of studies out there showing the brain to be active when people are engaged in all kinds of religious activity. This is not a threat to people that believe in God, it's simply showing that we are integrated physical and spiritual beings. And yes, we should expect brain networks to be involved as we engage in practice. If we're made by God to be physical and spiritual, then that's exactly what we should expect. It's not calling into question the authenticity of the experience or the existence of the experiencer that it originated from. But of course, there are, also instances, as you say, in sort of schizophrenic subjects where there can be, I think in those cases, I think it requires a kind of a sort of a broader approach. People that kind of know the person, know their background, know their spiritual history. It's very hard to sort of answer questions like that in the abstract without kind of honoring the person. I think this is very complicated, and I think that some people can actually have very profound spiritual experiences even amidst struggling with all kinds of mental illness. And I think that's a really huge area that again shows us the complexity of human beings. It also shows us that no one is beyond the reach of God, and that, if you happen to struggle with a particular area, that doesn't put you out of bounds of being reachable by God. He's not limited by the human brain or its capacity. So there's a lot to say there, but I think we see both continuity and discontinuity. Thank you for the question.
I think we have time for just one more question, if we have one. If not, suppose we could... Oh, you have one. Yeah?
Kind of thinking back to when you were considering these questions of mind and consciousness and what that means, what convinced you that the Christian story was the one that was the kind of the truth to believe? My understanding that quite a few different religions have this idea of there being something more than just your brain.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think, to be honest, I need to say that this whole consideration came later on. I became a Christian while I was studying biochemistry rather than brain imaging, neuroscience. So I was looking at quite a different area of the sciences. But it was also an area that I found to be really fascinating, that I really enjoyed. I think that the things for me were realizing that I could ask my questions and that there were helpful responses, and then I could look at the person of Jesus. I was really kind of moved by his life, moved by what he had come to do, and became persuaded that he had actually risen from the dead. I think that it was, again, a gradual thing, even not necessarily with kind of sort of very defined moments. It involved a lot of grilling my Christian friends and asking them some really hard questions. It involved actually going along to some of their meetings and being really moved by, you know, in my scientific head, I was trying to make sense of why I was like hearing beautiful music and having sort of like played lots of music in orchestras and so on, but why it felt like there was more than just sounds going on. I was actually being moved by something that if God was alive, then he was actually present. And I think that's what I was experiencing. So there was something about encountering something alongside looking at the person of Jesus and being persuaded that that was credible. What I was reading was credible, that he was credible, he was utterly unique and still alive, which is kind of a crazy thought and where it gets quite hard to explain to people that are not used to thinking about these things, but that Jesus has not remained in his grave, the only person in history that hasn't done that. And that's actually what sets him apart from other religious leaders. Actually, no one else claimed that they had the basis for doing that, which was being without any of the sin or stain that human beings have, that was going to take all of that on himself for us, die and then rise again, and then actually go and do it. There aren't any other examples of that in history, and then for to be actually, because of that, somehow still alive and at work through the Holy Spirit today. That all in a kind of a big melee. I didn't happen in a nice, clean, neat, scientific way for me, which is kind of annoying as a scientist, actually. But it was definitely real and a really important moment for me. I was a bit of a workaholic. I don't know if you're a workaholic in here. But I got really stressed about exams. And in these early days of choosing, I'm going to give this a go. I'm going to actually start to talk to God as if he actually exists. And I had a Bible. I can't even quite remember how I got hold of it. But I was open to like Psalm 27. The Psalms are like roughly in the middle, halfway through the Bible. You just open it about halfway, you reach the Psalms. These are just like really heartfelt prayers for people like being raw with God, not being polite, just being really raw. And there's a Psalm 27 that says, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" And I had a lot to fear. I had a lot to be afraid of. But suddenly it just became really obvious to me. There was someone that was bigger than me, that knew me, that I could actually cry out to, that I could ask for help, that would come to my help, that would help me not be afraid, get me through my exams, and so much more. And that was 30 years ago. Don't do the maths, please. And I can tell you, I'm even more convinced today, 30 years on, that the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? That is the invitation to you, to your friends, to anybody that wants to know that. No one is excluded. It is for everyone.
Thank you. Shall we thank Sharon in the traditional way? Thank you. Now, we are the Christian Postgraduate and Staff Network, and we meet up to consider questions about the Christian faith and how that connects with our research and our studies. Our meetings are open to everyone who would like to come, whether they are a Christian or not, whether they're investigating or whether they think we all need a good talking to. Everybody is welcome. And next week we'll be having a talk by Andy on the beauty of mathematics and how his Christian faith links to that beauty and his research in the mathematical field. So do feel free to come along. That is 6 o'clock next week in the Arts Building, Fab Building. Okay, so do find our webpage from the flags and do go visit for all the possible activities that we run. So there's going to be a short break now, and then we're going to have a panel discussion, can a thinking person be a Christian? So if you have any questions about that, feel free to go and grab some food from the tent outside and come back for that discussion in about 10 minutes. Thank you. wall behind me, possibly? Yes, that's very small. It just says Slido. Oh, there you go. There you go. So if you would like to ask a question through Slido, please feel free to do that. If you'd like to put your hand up and ask a question, feel free to do that. So the first thing I'm going to do is to say we are the Christian Postgraduate and Staff Network, and we meet on campus to discuss the question of Christianity and how that intersects with the studies or with the research that we are doing, and to discuss questions of faith. And everybody is welcome, and there is a website which is on the flags, and do feel free to visit that and come along to any of our meetings that you wish. In particular, I'd like to flag that there is Andy Wang here is talking on the beauty of mathematics and how his Christian faith intersects with his research next Tuesday evening at 6 o'clock in the Fab building. So I'm going to start by asking the panelists to tell us who they are.
So hi, my name's Hannah. I'm a PhD student here at Warwick in biomedical science. I'm also the chair of the Christian Postgraduate and Staff Network here at Warwick.
My name's Peter Teagle. I work for an organisation called Friends International. My original degree was in cell biology, but took a very different turn and studied theology in Singapore and in Oxford. And I've worked with international students for 25 years.
Yeah, my name's Joseph, and come up from London, so I work for a church in an evangelist role for the last, few years, and studied at Brunel quite a few years ago now.
So in order to give you a little bit of time to think of your questions and get them on Slido, or have the courage to put your hand up, I thought I'd ask some starter questions. They're nice, easy ones. So the first one is, how can you be a good researcher and a Christian? Surely there will be some possibilities that your faith will close your mind to.
Yeah, that is definitely one for me. So how can you be a researcher and a Christian? I think, to start with, yes, Christians come to research with their assumptions, but so does everybody else. And so that is not a unique thing to having a faith. It is a complete myth, really, that you can do research, or especially me, I'm in science, in a vacuum. You will come with your assumptions, whether that is that there is a God, or that kind of the natural world is all that exists. We each have a worldview. We each have a set of assumptions that we build our lives on, and that ultimately affects everything that we do, and including our science or research. So in some ways there is an aspect of humility in that, in going, in recognising, okay, what are we assuming when we come into this? But also, I think being a Christian and being a researcher, I have great confidence in my research and in being able to learn more about our world, learn more about everything that goes on because of my faith. We trust that our world is rational, and my assumptions coming into that there is a rational world governed by a rational God, is really helpful in that and gives us some foundation. So yes, there are assumptions, but actually, if anything, they enhance it. But we do have to have a bit of humility in that as well.
So I've not been long in sort of academia as you have, but I've been in university, talking to university students for many, many years, and I had a conversation with a student of chemistry at Oxford University when we lived there, and he said, very, very respectfully, he said, "You do know, Peter, that you're kidding yourself, don't you? That there's no evidence for what you believe." And I looked at him and I said, "No evidence, really?" I said, "If I didn't believe now, after all the evidence I've seen, then I would be kidding myself." But the evidence that I'm talking about is an accumulation of lots and lots of different types of evidence, which are all pointing in the same direction. I gave this example yesterday. Forgive me if you were there. But as we were on holiday in the south of England, we were going along a beach, and I picked up a fossil. And that little fossil was just a bit of stone. But it suggests that actually that area of England was under a tropical sea at some point in the distant past. But it doesn't prove it. But as you go along the beach, you find more and more and more and more. And you find actually some fairly dramatic examples of sea creatures and so forth, which really, in a sense, prove that there was a tropical sea at that place in time. So the thing that my friend was saying was, in his experience, there was no proof. I was saying, in my experience, there is. And I think we need to be open to the fact that there may be a whole range of things which are just happened in this world which we may not even be open to because of our assumptions.
I don't have much to say, but I can say one thing. I could just say one thing that, ironically, it was when I started to study at university was where I started to think those bigger questions that we normally ignore. So actually, being a Christian actually causes you to think about questions we normally try and shun away. And the Bible kind of flips it and says, actually, we naturally suppress the truth. And it's when you become a Christian, you start to actually consider truth. So it's actually the opposite. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So my next nice, easy question is, my Muslim friends tell me the Bible has been drastically altered. How can a thinking person base their life on a book that is unreliable?
Okay. Just to say, I'm not a Muslim. I have never been a Muslim. So please understand that what I'm saying, if you come from a Muslim background, please, I mean, it is inevitable if I say something which you disagree with, you may feel offended, but please understand that I do not mean any offense. Sometimes it's just difficult to hear something which you hold very dear being questioned. So with that in mind, so I've talked to a lot of Muslims over the years, ever since university, and one of two questions usually comes up. One is, surely the Bible has been altered. I think they mean the New Testament particularly. And the other question is, how can Jesus be God? He was just a man. But actually those two questions are linked, because the New Testament as it stands shows very clearly that Jesus is God and said he was God and rose again from the dead and so forth. So if the New Testament is correct, then Jesus is this and he did this. And yet the Quran, as I read it, says that absolutely, well, it says two things. It says, in one sense, Christians are people of the book. So that is, we follow a tradition of, or part of a tradition of prophets from Moses to Jesus to Muhammad. But on the other hand, there are very clear things in the Quran which say something very, very different from the New Testament. That Jesus is not God, God did not have a son, and that he was not crucified. And so the reality is that Christianity and Islam cannot be, they are mutually exclusive. They say very, very different things. I think the answer to the reason why people say that the Bible has been changed is because of that. But Christianity that was around, a version of Christianity that was around in the time of Muhammad in the Arabian Peninsula was a form of Christianity which has died out now. It wasn't actual Christianity, it was something which exists a little bit in the Jehovah's Witnesses today. It's called Arianism, or versions of that, which was the denial of Jesus is God and of the Trinity. So there's a slight confusion as to what exactly the teachings of the Quran were against. But when it comes to actually about whether the New Testament has been changed, Absolutely, it hasn't. The Bible that I have here is based on, or the New Testament is based on Greek scriptures, Greek text, which is almost exactly the same as was originally written. And we know that because just in the same way that genetics tests that my family had discovered that my wife was linked to a woman from the Hmong tribe in Vietnam 10,000 years ago, you can detect, you can find the links or the small kind of changes that happen in a script. You can trace them back to where they originated and you can correct them. And we've got hundreds of manuscripts before the time of Muhammad which prove that it isn't so.
Yeah, so part of my journey was looking into Islam before Christianity, so this was something I had to deal with. And I think that answer sufficiently covers it. I just think it's also interesting that the Quran itself affirms the New Testament and the Old Testament as the word of God. So the question to ask back is, when was it changed? If it was changed after the Quran, which was written hundreds of years after the New Testament, how could it have been changed? Because the Bible had already spread across the world, and we've got manuscripts dating before the Quran, as you've said. So there's that. But I just think also just the book of the Bible as a revelation is so different to any other religious book, because especially the Quran's one revelation ultimately given to a man in a period of time, whereas the Bible's been revealed over 1,500 years, written by 40 different authors that didn't live at the same time, most of them. And yet as you read it, it's one message, one story. It's amazing. So when I had doubts about the Bible, I wrestled with this very question. And it was only as I started to read it, I came to the conclusion, has to be a book of divine origin. It's such a unique book in terms of how it was revealed. And there's prophecies, for example, in the Old Testament, hundreds of years before Christ, that is then fulfilled by him to the letter. I think there's hundreds of prophecies that were fulfilled. So read the Bible for yourself, I think, if you're struggling with that question. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to very briefly add to that on the end, there are multiple verses in the New Testament that encourage you to look at it and examine the evidence. It's not asking for blind faith, it's asking for, look at this. Right at the end of one of the eyewitness testimonies of Jesus, John, it says, these things were written so that you may believe. It says, look at the evidence and make the conclusion from it. I'd encourage you to do that and read it for yourself.
Which segues beautifully into one of our contributed questions. If the evidence is really there, why doesn't everyone believe in Christianity?
I think it's a very good question. I think we all come from different cultures, and in my wife's PhD, she kind of taught me. My wife always complains that I borrow things from her PhD and then talk about them from the stage, and she wouldn't do that. But basically, she talks about plausibility shelters, and that if you're amongst a community of people who believe one thing, then that it seems more reasonable, because you've got other people who are believing that. And that is true for Christians as well as everybody else. The hard thing is when you come out of that plausibility shelter, but it's very uncomfortable. If there is something that you have always believed, it is very hard to kind of go, that's wrong. Because it may cost you everything. To say, for example, using the last question, okay, right, well, the Bible's true, the Quran is not. That's a very big deal if you come from a Muslim family. Not just because of the intellectual kind of, well, this is right, this is wrong, I've been wrong, therefore I have to kind of correct things. You're standing against everything in your culture. And although that's particularly stark in the example I've just given, that's true of all of us. It was true of me becoming a Christian from being an atheist, because I just couldn't understand that God could be real. And it's very hard to kind of face that. I recognize we need to move a bit quicker.
I just want to say one quick thing, that I think it's not that there's not enough evidence, it's that I don't want it to be true. So it's a similar, it's literally put that way in the Bible, that there's a suppression of the truth, which is an active thing on our part, because it makes sense. If I want to live my life my way, and this book tells me that there's a God who made me and he's my authority, and I have to turn from those things which I love to do, I'm going to kick against that. So I think it's not so much, it's I don't want it to be true, is the argument I think the Bible puts, is one element of it. It's not the only thing, but I think that's something that's going on.
So another contributed question, do you think there are any research questions that shouldn't be asked or explored, and does this limit your worldview?
My instant answer is no. I think if Christianity is true and the Bible is true, then it will stand up to intellectual scrutiny. And I don't think as Christians we need to be worried about that. And I think if you're not a Christian, I think you can look into it with an open mind, not assuming, if you're coming from a materialistic point of view that there is nothing more, then that is the answer you will get. So with an open mind, no, I don't think there is. You start getting into slightly moral, ethical things of should we? You start thinking a lot about, I don't know, maybe you're like nuclear weapons or other weapon systems of application. And this is where you get into the, okay, is it right that we are developing things that could cause mass harm? And that's where each person has to decide that based on what they believe is right or wrong. Yeah.
It says, some of you left your field of study to pursue faith. Do a person of science with convictions have to do the same?
Could you repeat that, please?
Could you put it back up?
I think it was about kind of, do you need to leave your field of study?
Some of you have left your field of study to persuade faith. Do a person of science with convictions have to do the same?
As a person who is a scientist and a Christian, absolutely not. It's not okay, once you become a Christian, that's it, you don't study anything else. Maybe things will change in the future, but I am fully planning on staying in science for at least the next few years, because I think there is so much good and value in learning more about the world that God has given us, to finding more about about God through that as well. We are designed to work, and there are things that we can do to help others, and also just for intellectual curiosity on its own. Science is good, and it's a good thing, and it's a God-honouring thing to pursue that.
I think this question might be pointed at me, actually. But I think I did a degree in cell biology, but that really wasn't my kind of real heart interest. My heart interest is in other cultures, in the practical application of Christianity to different cultures. That's kind of really why I didn't change, because I felt that Christianity didn't fit with my studies.
Thank you. What's the one piece of evidence that convinced you to believe in Christianity over any other religion?
Well, since I'm holding the microphone, you're handing over. I thought you were going to add to the question. So for me, it started with not so much a piece of evidence, but a logical conclusion to my own worldview. The evidence came very forcibly later. So the kind of crisis moment for me was, as an atheist, I was alone in my room one night, and I kind of looked up into the darkness and just felt this overwhelming sense of being utterly, utterly alone. Now, I come from a good family. I had more friends then than ever before. I was in a good place, except that just this overwhelming feeling of loneliness, because I sensed that if I was right and my Christian friends were wrong, the logical conclusion to what I believe is that this is a meaningless universe. And therefore, I am meaningless. That my life, here I was at the kind of the cusp of adulthood, and I'm about to live a meaningless life. And I just couldn't bear it. I wept. Because deep down, I just could not accept, or I just couldn't accept the conclusion to my own worldview, which was that we live in a meaningless universe, and therefore human beings are meaningless. But that wasn't the evidence. And the evidence, the overwhelming evidence for me, is the massive change in my own life. The freedom inside from habits that I couldn't control, from things which dominated me, and the true inner freedom, amazing freedom inside. But also to see that played out in the lives of countless people from radically different cultures. To meet people who come from the Naga Hills in northern Myanmar, from Bangkok, from Japan, having the same experience of God as I have, and they find the same inner change. And also, I know I won't go into this now, but also physical healings as well, which I've experienced and others have. It was just that was it for me.
I think if there is one piece of evidence I'd encourage you to look at if you are thinking about this, it is the evidence for the resurrection, because ultimately Christianity stands or falls on the resurrection. And the Bible says this. It says, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, your faith is in vain. So where do you start? Look at the evidence of the resurrection, that Jesus truly, physically rose from the dead 2,000 years ago. There's a great little, very easy read book called Your Verdict on the Empty Tomb by Val Grieve. And it's brilliant. It takes through this, different pieces of evidence for the resurrection and encourages you to look at it for yourself and see what conclusion you make from it. So yeah, if there's going to be one piece of evidence, the resurrection.
I'd only add something else because I fully agree with both those answers. The only thing I would add is in my personal journey, which did look into other religions first and then was absolutely convinced by Jesus, it was simply also the message of Christianity. So now I can safely say all the religions are here saying very similar things, and Christianity's over here. And it's the exact opposite of religion. So I could give you loads of examples. Religion says you need to do this in order to get this from God. And if you don't do this, you're not going to get this. Christianity says grace, undeserved love, that God comes down to us while we're still sinners. I was someone struggling with guilt. Religion's answer to guilt is do more, try harder, stop this, pray this, fast. Christianity said, no, give up. You can't fix it. God's done it for you because he loves you. So when I started hearing the gospel, after looking into so many different religions, this was in another realm. This was the absolute opposite of what I was discovering in religion. So yeah, that's just to complement the other two.
Thank you so much. There's been a changeover. My name is Miriam, for those who don't know. And just to check, we are approaching 2 o'clock, so if anyone needs to go, they can. But I believe we are going over slightly, because we did start a bit late. So question on Slido, how do you reconcile evolution with creation?
Christians do not agree on this, so I am not going to claim to have the ultimate truth and answer on this. But what they do all agree on is that God created the world, and it was through God and for God. And whether you come from a point of view of kind of a theistic evolution, which is kind of a God-guided evolution, or whether actually it was either a 7-day creation, 6-day creation. You're going to get different answers, but what we can be sure of and what we can have confidence in and encouragement from is that we are made by God and made for a purpose, and so is the world. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Before I became a Christian, my Christian friends basically made it almost like a condition. Like if I was going to be a Christian, I had to sign up to the whole 6-day literal creation, and I couldn't do that. Now, I've been all around the houses of this one for many years, but the place I've landed up is that I believe the Bible is true. And I believe the Bible is true in the way it was intended. But when you come to the passages of the Bible which, whether you say it's 6 days or it's 6 periods of time, or whether you as Hannah says, theistic evolution, where you believe that God used evolution as a mechanism, which I'm basically happy with. So I've got 3 kids. Well, they're not kids anymore; they're in their 20s. But when they're little, they say to me, "Daddy, where do babies come from?" What do you say? What do you say to a 5-year-old who says, "Daddy, where do babies come from?" Do you go into cell division, meiosis and mitosis? Do you do that? Do you kind of give them the graphic details of what happens? No, you basically have a choice of 2 answers, traditionally. One, you came from mummy's tummy. 2, a big white bird, a stork, came along and drops you down the chimney. And now, neither of those are in any way accurate. One of them is true, and one of them is a story made up to basically stop children asking stupid questions. And I'm personally convinced that the Bible is true in its description of how God made the world, in the sense that Hannah has just said, because it is that God made the world, and it was written into a period of time where there are different versions of how the world was made, and most of them, or all of them, were like the big white bird dropping the baby down the chimney. And so I can be confident coming to the Bible, knowing that in its original context, that is what it was trying to say. It's true, just missing a lot of details.
The only thing I would add is just to show the differences is I would be someone that holds to a 6-day literal creation and fully convinced by that. So you can see even on the panel difference of opinion.
Okay, gonna ask a bit of a tricky question. Why does God exist?
When we ask why does something else exist, we are presuming that it didn't at some point. Why, even where, again, going back to the question of where did I come from? There's a reason, and you can answer it differently, but why do I exist has to come from an argument of, well, I didn't exist before. Whereas God is outside of that framework that we exist in. And so it's almost a question of, well, actually, if something has always existed and will always exist, then God just exists. And that's not necessarily an easy answer to that question, but I think the assumption there falls with God, and therefore you can't really answer it.
Is the question behind the question? Is the question behind the question, do we need God to exist? See, that may well be kind of like, do we need a God, or can we answer everything through science, etc.? Do you think that's it?
We can do that one as well. Why does God exist? Again, it's a question of okay, why? When we come to ask questions about Christianity, we are not coming from a point of, okay, we could really do with something to clear up some gaps in our knowledge. As a Christian, I firmly believe that God has revealed himself to us. It's almost a backwards thing of saying, look, you're like, here am I, here, especially in the person of Jesus and in his word. Again, I'm answering the question slightly backwardly, but we can go into lots of evidence of why we need God for morality, why we need God to understand. And I do think that all of those questions stand up to why God has and Christianity has a good, a true, and a better story for all of those kind of questions. But ultimately, why do we need God? Because he underpins and is the creator of all things. And then kind of all those other things kind of come out from that a little bit.
Yeah, fully agree. And I just think it's flipping the question around. Why did he make me? He's the cause. So sometimes we ask questions putting us at the center as if I made everything. And I'm asking, why is there a God? But actually, maybe a better question. It's a good question. It's a deep question. But maybe a more interesting question and one that might affect life in so many ways is, why did he make me? It flips it on its head. And I just find it interesting when Moses asked God, who shall I send? Or who shall I say sent me? And God says, I am who I am. What? That captures it, doesn't it? I am who I am. Yeah.
Thank you. I believe there's one more question on the Slido. Some of the Christians I know don't seem very free and seem to be controlled by their religion too. How do you explain this?
Yeah, I can imagine, Joe, you've got something to say on this one. Following Jesus is impossible. Following Jesus is really hard, and it is, humanly speaking, impossible. The only way it is possible is by opening our lives to ask God by his Holy Spirit to do in us what we can't do ourselves. And I've lived for years with things that I knew that God wanted me to do, and I just couldn't do it. I lived for years with things that I knew I shouldn't do, but I just couldn't stop it. And the reality is that I was trying to live as a Christian using me. And it's a bit like trying to pull yourself up to a meter above the ground using your own shoelaces. It is impossible. And very often, I think, we look at a Christian who kind of is struggling with guilt or with kind of like what we call legalism, which is kind of following the rules and not being very free, etc. It's often because we haven't quite made that step between recognizing what God is asking us to do and realizing that we can't do it. We need God's Holy Spirit to do it. However, I've also experienced the amazing power of God to change those things that is impossible for me to change myself. And that is actually the more genuine version of Christianity. That is what Jesus is calling us to do. And people find it at different stages. So if you see like a snapshot of somebody at kind of a stage where they're struggling with this, you should see it when they're free. It is amazing. Joe, I'm sure you have got.
Yeah, as someone who spent 23 years of my life completely living for myself, doing what I wanted, parents weren't strict, I had complete freedom. And the irony is I would look back at that time and say I wasn't free, although I convinced myself I was, and now I'm free. And I think it's just because the Bible flips our idea of freedom around. We think freedom is living for me. I choose, I do what I want. That's freedom. Jesus says, I will set you free. He talks as though we are imprisoned. by something called sin. Now you're thinking, here we go, sin. But actually, when you look at what sin is, it is this mindset of living for me, doing what I want. And when you look at the results of that, it's not freedom. You're actually controlled by something that only harms you and harms others. If you look at people that just go their own way and do what they want, they always end up in a mess. With them, when the shackles are off, it's self-destruction. So actually, the Bible describes us as under this horrible power, and actually, it's the Lord picking you up, setting you on your feet, and you're living this new free life as you were made to live. So there is this sense of freedom. Oh, this is what I'm made to do. It's like I was in a prison over here, and now I've got this freedom, this joy. So I think it's understanding what true freedom is, and the Bible kind of turns it on its head. I think that when you most live for yourself, you're most miserable. I don't know if people can relate to that.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions, any burning questions from the floor? No? Do the panelists have any final words they want to share with our audience today?
I wrote a book. So if you're an international student and you are interested in how Christianity relates to cultures outside the West, we only have a couple of copies in this room at this moment, but there's more in my boot. So if you'd like a copy, they are free. It's called Is Christianity a Western Religion? And Other Questions International Students Ask. If you're not an international student, you also may find it very useful.
I've not read all of it, but I've read parts, and I would recommend.
Peter, Joe, Hannah, thank you so much. There's a question that's popped up on Slido. Do you want to answer it, or do you think...
Yeah. Well, I haven't read it first. I'm going to say yes.
When people say they don't believe the Bible or that there isn't a God, do you think that they mean it, or is it a facade they put up?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. But I think it comes back again to this idea of suppressing the truth. And I think we've all got experience of convincing ourselves of things that we maybe don't fully agree with. And for some people, that might be the case. And for others, then no, I think they are set on it and they do truly believe it.
Yeah, I think that suppressing the truth picture is really powerful, because I think people are genuine when they say that. And do they mean it, or a facade they put up? I mean, I think the suppressing the truth verse is particularly talking about this idea of a God. And I think you can convince yourself of something and it becomes your reality. And the funny thing about that verse is that it's a suggestion of everywhere, every time you walk out of your door and you see a tree or you see the sky, it's consistently telling you there is a God, there is a God, there is a God. And every time we're doing this. So it's such an interesting picture. So I do believe it's genuine. I do believe you can genuinely think, you genuinely believe those things, but there is an active suppression of it at the same time that you're doing, maybe even subconsciously. You're not even realizing that you're doing it. I don't know if you've got anything more to say on that.
Yeah, I mean, when I got known as the most awkward atheist in college, because I would seek out Christians to ask them questions, difficult questions, and they were terrible at answering my questions. They really were bad. But we were, 16, 17, and what do people know at that stage? But I'd at least reasonably thought through those things at that stage, whereas a lot of my friends hadn't. And but my questions were genuine. But the difference was, they saw me as attacking them, whereas in reality, I was desperate for them to actually show me something real. And the same happened several years before when I was 12 and I looked around at my parents kind of going to church sort of routine, which didn't seem very deep, and I was desperate for them to show me something real. And I didn't see anything real in the very formal, kind of traditional version of Christianity that my parents had. And all the time, I just wanted something real. And I think somebody asking that question is looking for something real. And what we are sitting here doing is telling you that we found something real. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. I think what I'll do, because I know that there is another question on Slido, but there is a chance that more questions might appear as they're answering that one. So we can finish the panel session here. Please feel free to approach either Joe, Hannah, Peter with that question or any other questions you might have individually. But for now, I will invite you all to thank our panelists today. Just a reminder, we have a session coming up next week with Andy Wang, 6 p.m. in the Fab building. That's our next CPS event, so please do join us for that. Thank you.